We're about a minute away. If we could get organized wherever we're going to be, find your seat. Or those of you in the hallway, come in and we will begin our Bible class together. We have only about another month to tell the story. We're trying to know Jesus. I just want to say as we begin that one of the primary goals we ought to have in mind for knowing Jesus is so that we can more effectively show Jesus. Because if we don't know, it's really hard to share. And so they go hand in hand to think about knowing Jesus and then being able to show Jesus to other people. We're going to come today to our question again. I really struggle because I want to know so many details. I'm one of those, tell me the what, the when, the where. I grew up that way. That's how I was trained. That's the way church always was. And yet at times, I think we don't catch the who if we don't have that awareness. Sometimes it's important for us to understand sequencing and understand the dynamics and understand the people and the context and to read as literature. Who are the other people in the story and what's going on? So it's not just the who of Jesus, it's the who of everybody else that's going on as well. This is just a real quick look at how the Gospels are organized. The way we've organized them at least. There's a real narrow slice of the gospel story that talks about the birth and childhood of Jesus. Actually, the slice is not as big as it may look when we say 6%, because there's some history and some background and the story of John the Baptist. Then we have divided the gospel in a way that devotes almost a seventh of the story. Jesus comes on the scene like an explosion. I mean, it's amazing how rapidly the story develops. If you think about Mark, straightway, right after this, or some translations immediately. But then it's almost as though we jump over what would seem to us to be an important part of the story, because we tell 2 years of ministry, about 10% of the gospel story in each of those 2 years. And then we come to the last year of his ministry, and it's going to take a third of the gospels, 3 lessons for us to deal with that. We are not going to repeat the markers, except just to say that when we come to the feeding of the 5,000, we know we're a year away. The question I have for us then is, there's our chart, if you want to see it in a different form. That's been made available as also one of the photos available on the Facebook page, and you can find it on my Facebook page. You can find it on the Who is Jesus Facebook page, and you can find it in the study guide. But here's the question that comes to my mind as we come together today. What happened after the second prediction of Jesus' death? In Luke's gospel, the first prediction is Luke 9:22, the second prediction is Luke 9:44, and in 51 it says the time approached for him to be taken to heaven, and Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. Don't think that he began a single journey to Jerusalem at that point and eventually got there. If you read the story carefully, in that same context of Luke 9, beginning in verse 51, they go to a Samaritan village. He has people with him. James and John are with him. He's traveling with his disciples. There's the question about the Samaritans rejecting him. You want us to call down fire from heaven. By the end of the next chapter, he's in Jerusalem at the house of Mary and Martha. We know that story. But whenever we come to John, which we studied last week, at the Feast of Tabernacles in September, or maybe early October, his brothers wanted him to go to Jerusalem with them. He said, no, I'm not going right now. He goes up later by himself. That's a different trip to Jerusalem. I think the point of Luke 9:51 is that Jesus now, thinking about his calling, he's determined to complete his mission. He's going to complete his reason for coming. And what we probably should be noting is that he spends more and more time in Judea. He goes down there, has conflicts with Jewish leaders, then he's back in Galilee. And then he's back down there again, and there are conflicts, and then he's back in Galilee. When we come to the text, I'm going to still stay in Luke for just a moment. When we come to the text of Luke chapter 17, I don't have it on the slide, verse 11, it says, now he is on his way to Jerusalem. He travels the border between Samaria and Galilee. But I do think this might be the last departure from Galilee. In Luke 17, verse 11, maybe the same one that we're reading about in Matthew 19:1 or Mark 10:1 when he leaves for the final time, but not the one of John 7:1. This is probably things you've never even talked about in your study. And it comes because we're trying to bring all of these together. So what should we say? Jesus now, having predicted his death a second time, begins to center his ministry in Judea. Not exclusively, but he's there more and more. He's there for the feast. He's there with Mary and Martha. He's there with a Pharisee. And that's the story that we're telling today. We're moving approximately from the tabernacles in September. We'll end with the raising of Lazarus, which is probably about a month before his crucifixion. So we're moving from tabernacles. We'll go past John 10 with the Feast of Dedication in December. We're going to cover almost 6 months, at least 5 months. And Jesus is more and more in the area of Judea. The other thing I want you to note, and please remember and think about over the next 2 weeks, Jesus wasn't trying to cause problems in his early ministry. He was helping people. But it's almost as though now he does everything he can to upset the Jewish leaders. He says things like, well, don't you know? Haven't you read? Well, if we spent much time in the church and someone came to us and said, haven't you ever read your Bible before? That could be offensive, especially if you're a leader and you're one who's supposed to know. So the conflict is coming. Jesus is centering his life in Jerusalem more and more, or the area of Jerusalem, and that's how we pick up the story today. We welcome you to the 6th lesson as we try to understand the importance of the question, who do you say that I am?
Exactly. And these questions and Jesus' statements are getting much, much more direct, more focused. They've gone from kind of the top of the funnel. Now he is looking for true believers, and he's paring down large crowds.
We are in the last year of Jesus' ministry. So we covered in the last lesson 6 months from a Passover to the Feast of Tabernacles.
Right.
After the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus goes back to Galilee. Very little detail in Scripture about October, November. But we're going to pick up the story again.
Right.
And very soon he's going to go back to Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication, what we know today as Hanukkah, and obviously in December. So the study for this lesson comes from Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 and following, just 2 or 3 verses at the beginning of the chapter. Same thing in Mark 10, a couple of verses at the beginning of the chapter that mention that Jesus is leaving Galilee.
Right.
And then primarily from Luke chapter 9 through chapter 17, but also in John 9 and 10 for the Feast of Dedication, and we'll eventually end up with the raising of Lazarus. But we'll hold that story until we get there.
Okay.
In all of that.
Again, these stories, the conflict is much more direct. And as you remember, where we left the last video, they're picking up rocks and they're trying to stone Jesus to death. They can't get it done. But this idle hatred, this idle, dislike is starting to have some flesh put on the bones of this, and things are coming to a head.
Well, Jesus' time is approaching.
That's right.
And he's going to make it easier for them. Luke describes it as the journey to Jerusalem.
That's right.
That begins in Luke chapter 9 after the second prediction of Jesus' death. And during this travel, as he goes to Jerusalem and then returns home, goes back to Jerusalem, it's interesting how this Jerusalem journey unfolds, because it's not just one journey and eventually you'll get there.
Right.
But in the midst of all of this, Jesus is constantly teaching. And in the context of Luke, there perhaps is no better description of Jesus' teachings than to call them reversal stories, because expectations are being shattered and everything is being turned upside down.
Right.
And there is story after story, parable after parable that shows that reality, beginning with the story of the Good Samaritan.
Right, which is a major reversal. Again, the focus has changed. Things have gone from, here's a parable to find truth in. These are confrontational now.
Yes.
And they are aimed at people for soliciting a response. And boy, this Good Samaritan story solicits a big response.
And many of them are aimed pretty specifically at the Pharisees.
Exactly.
More than once, it says that they were angry with him because they knew he was talking about them.
Yeah.
For example, when he told the story of the prodigal son.
Exactly.
Which is in this context of Luke 9 through chapter 17.
Right. And so his language is like, you brood of vipers, you big pile of snakes. How are you going to, escape this coming wrath? I'm the creator of the world, and I'm not seeing how you guys are going to make it. And so this is you talk about a come to Jesus moment.
Yeah. So in the late fall, early December perhaps, Jesus goes to Jerusalem, sends 72 ahead of him, which is an interesting approach. He goes through the Samaritan area, which he did not always do. James and John want to call down fire in that context of Luke chapter 9. But I don't want to spend too much time in that part of the journey, because what happens at the Feast of Dedication, what happens at that encounter in John 9 and 10, beginning with the blind man who has been blind since birth, and then into John 10, which we've already mentioned briefly. Why don't you tell us if you're really the Christ? Just go ahead and admit it. And he says, I think I have. Right. So I want to bring all of that into a context and think about it. If you could start that for us.
Yeah, I just, Bartimaeus, has been blind since birth. Everybody that knows him knows he's blind. There's no doubt. And Jesus, he's sitting there minding his own business. And Jesus approaches him on the Sabbath. This is not on a Wednesday, not on a Thursday. This is on the Sabbath, and sitting in front of the temple where everybody could, this is on purpose. And he's about to perform this miracle for one reason, and that is to make a point. And so he heals him. And immediately the Pharisees, some people see a miracle, and the other people see a law broken. And so the Pharisees come, they drag him in and question him, And he's like, well, this man, his name's Jesus, and he's from Nazareth, and he healed me, and that's all I know. And so they call his parents in. And the parents completely disown this kid. And so they kick him out of the temple, which is meaning they judge him and they just shoot him off to hell. He's condemned. And so he is sitting there minding his own business. He gets his eyesight back, but he loses his family. That was the cost. And he gets kicked out of the synagogue, which means he's condemned to hell. And so he's sitting there like, what just happened to me? And Jesus, he didn't go look for Jesus. Jesus comes and looks for him. And he says, you know, he tells him who he is. This is about who he is at that moment. And so now he's an evangelist, and he is proclaiming who Jesus really is.
And this is the context of Jesus being the good shepherd,
right.
Another I am statement,
right.
And also Jesus being the door, another I am statement. Because the story of the healing of the blind man in John 9 is kind of separated from the two accounts in Mark, I'd like to put those three blind man stories side by side, because we've already mentioned in our previous study that we have a blind man story in Mark 8. That's the man who required the second touch, which in the context of Peter not understanding, and the disciples not understanding, and the Jews not understanding, transfiguration, we don't have understanding. It looks like everyone was needing a second touch.
Exactly.
And then eventually, at the very end of that year, which is actually in the next video or next study, we're going to come to Jericho. We're going to meet Bartimaeus. And here in the middle, in John 9, we have yet a third blind man story, which you just described for us. And I want to use that John 9 story to take us into John 10, to the encounter of Jesus with the Jews at the Feast of Dedication, because it's just such an amazing story. After he has told the parable of the Good Shepherd, he asserts his deity. You know, the thing that we continually call attention to, Jesus is the King coming in his kingdom, and the Jews surround him. And it says they began saying to him, I can almost hear, this is not just one representative, this is a whole bunch of folks. I mean, he's kind of being interviewed, and everyone is asking pretty much the same question in a different form. How long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you're the Christ, just tell us plainly. And he says, you don't believe because you're not seeing. You don't have your eyes open. Just look at what I'm doing. Look at what's happening. But they have looked because they know.
They do.
Yeah,
and this is going from not really understanding to people are understanding, and he's shoving them in a corner. And all of Scripture does this. It shoves you in a corner and it makes you choose. Hebrews 4:12 says the Word of God is living and active. It's sharper than any two-edged sword. It splits us in half. It shoves us in a corner and makes us choose. It says it judges the thoughts and intentions of the human heart. We think we read these words. We don't. They read us. They expose what we can see. And when we are looking for Christ, if we are not willing to open our eyes and to see Him and hear Him as He truly, I mean, every parable, he who has ears, let him hear. And the blind need to see. And we are looking to answer this question, who do I say that Jesus is? Not who do other people say that Jesus is. But I want to know Him, and the only way to see that is in these stories, to see the nuance of how He moves this and makes people, forces them to choose.
Yeah. Well, it's not His time yet, but it's almost His time. We know we are now 3 months from Jesus' crucifixion because it's December. And we know what's going to happen in the spring. But it's not His time, so John 10 concludes by saying they were trying to arrest Him, but He eluded their grasp. But here's an interesting thing to me. As we try to read the story in order, it says in the last verses of John 10, He went away to the place where John was first baptizing. And He stayed there, and many, many people came and believed on Him there. Jesus ends his ministry at the place it began. We go back to
Full
the place
circle.
of the
Yeah.
baptism,
Yeah.
and now many people believe.
Exactly.
Is that not incredible?
It is. The
As you-
people who were probably present in that moment, many of those same people are now present in this moment.
Yeah. I think there's a good chance that Jesus retired back to Galilee after that point and again began to travel to Jerusalem. We have a number of parables in the context of Luke, again, chapters 9 through 17 in a very general way, teachings about prayer. He's constantly speaking out against the Pharisees. Right. You can't miss that. Judgment, there's a healing of a woman, teachings of various kinds. But in this context, because we continually talk about putting stuff in the top of the funnel and bringing it down to a focal point, this is where Jesus talks about counting the cost in Luke chapter 14.
Yeah, it's just amazing. He has already done this in Matthew 10 to some degree. He says, that I haven't come to bring peace. And that's what everybody's looking for. They're looking for a resolution to the Roman occupation. They're looking for a kingdom on earth. And he's like, no, that's not what I'm here. I've come to actually cause division. I brought a sword, and I'm going to
make a
separate.
Decision.
Right, exactly. I'm going to shove you in a corner. And you decide, and it comes to that again, like you're saying, is counting the cost. Is that everybody's trying to decide whether or not Jesus is who he says he is, or is he worthy? And he is saying, no, unless you deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me, you're not worthy of me. And so he is really, really making it so plain that people are going to have to give everything. This is not something you're adding to your religious beliefs. And so many people try to do this today. We ask Jesus to follow us. And he's like, no, it doesn't work that way. You're going to follow me. What part of deny yourself and count the cost? And whoever puts that hand to the plow and looks back is not worthy of me. And so whoever's trying to save their life is going to lose it. But if you lose your life, if you deny yourself, come to the end of yourself, and let me be your life, you'll find it.
There's another phrase that catches my attention in the context of Luke 14 because it's so clear, and you have to make a decision. I think today we water it down, and we often think, well, he couldn't have really meant that. But he says 3 times, except you do this, you cannot be my disciple. And he says it again. Cannot be my disciple.
Right.
That's not too hard to understand.
No.
Even though we don't like the message.
Yeah.
It means priorities. It means making decisions. It becomes imitators. We become imitators of Jesus Christ. And so he is constantly calling people to follow him, to give up everything.
Right.
And follow him. And some will, perhaps.
Right.
But it's a slow process as they finally come to grips with who Jesus really is.
Right. And Jesus has always been such a part of that, even on the Sermon on the Mount. But he just said, unless you change and become like a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. And so it has always been his message, but it is becoming so poignant now.
Well, we have a little interruption here. But it can't really be an interruption because this is God's time frame and timeline. So it's all happening on God's timeline. But as Jesus is traveling and as he's teaching, and as we think about all of these parables, and we've already mentioned the Good Samaritan and parables about prayer. We've talked about counting the cost. We've already mentioned the parable of the prodigal son. Jesus gets news of the death of Lazarus.
Right.
Now, I don't know how far away he was. I don't think he was 4 days away because the text says that there was a delay so that the disciples would believe.
Right.
But he's at least a couple of days away, perhaps.
Right.
And so he makes another trip to Bethany, just outside Jerusalem, and encounters Mary and Martha, and of course raises Lazarus from the dead, which is a story that is easily lost This is the last event in the lesson today. We're going to flesh it out here in a moment.
Right.
But we now have covered another 4 months. We're probably about maybe 2 months, or even just a few weeks, a little less than 2 months from Jesus' crucifixion. I want to see how that is ultimately coming to a head. But let's come to John 11 and the story of Lazarus.
Wow.
And the news of Lazarus's death, and then what Jesus goes through to raise him.
Right. This is probably the most critical moment in defining and drawing this line in the sand, because this was not a surprise for Jesus. He knew this was going to happen, and he says in verse 4 that this sickness will not end in death. And so again, he's speaking spiritually, not physically. And this is probably the closest family to him on earth.
Right.
Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And so he deliberately, to make a point, doesn't go immediately. He waits, and then waits for Lazarus to pass. And he gets there and he tells them plainly, Lazarus is dead, in verse 14. And so he goes back. Bethany is less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many of the Jews had come, and Mary and Martha were comforting them in their loss. And so we have people traveling from Jerusalem, and they're there when Jesus, when Lazarus dies. They're at the funeral. They saw him, put into the tomb.
Right.
They were there, and they're mourning with the family. And Jesus comes, and Martha runs out and says to him, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And he's like, no, you don't understand. I am the resurrection and the life. He'll be raised again. She's like, oh, I know that at the last day he's going to be raised. And he's like, no, you don't understand. I am the resurrection.
Another one of those I am statements.
I am the life.
Yeah.
And she is thinking that this resurrection is some future event. No, the resurrection is a person, and his name is Jesus. He's the way, he's the truth, he is the life. And so all of this is just such a dramatic thing. And so now he calls forth Lazarus. He comes out, take the grave clothes off, and everybody witnesses this. Jews, Sadducees, Pharisees, everybody knew Lazarus. This was the most public miracle, because he's 4 days dead. And she's like, don't open that. The smell's going to be bad. The decomp is already starting. And he's like, you don't understand who you're dealing with. This was the miracle that got Jesus crucified. And so when you're talking about all of these things happening and people kind of, on the fence on who Jesus is, they're not on the fence anymore.
Everyone knew.
Everybody knows now. And so everything is going from, we're going to, pick up rocks and stone him. No, they're making a plan now to kill Jesus. And so the Pharisees and the Sadducees come together in an organized plot and set up a hit. And they think to themselves later on here that we got to take Lazarus out too. We are now going to cover up the evidence of this whole thing. And so this has taken on a whole new dimension, and it is willful defiance, because they have seen the truth. And this is what Jesus talks about in John in chapter 3, and he says that people prefer the darkness.
Right.
They won't come into the light when your deeds are evil, and this is what we see these Jewish leaders doing.
Now, this conflict was so severe that the Bible says he withdrew to Ephraim,
Right.
which is probably between 10 and 15 miles back to the north. His time is not quite.
Right.
We're still a month or 6 weeks away.
Right.
And in our next lesson, we will finish the journey to Jerusalem. But just remember, there now is a plot to cover up the evidence.
That's right.
Even to kill Lazarus, because we now are seeing more clearly than ever
That's right.
who Jesus is. But our question still remains, who do you think he is?
That's right.
God bless. See you next time.
Well, that was convenient that they highlighted the word your, at least for half of you on whichever slide that you may be choosing to look at. I want to tell you what attracts my attention. Isn't it amazing with how central the Lazarus story is in the Gospel of John, that we don't have it in Matthew or Mark or Luke? John said he was writing so that you might believe. I mean, this is power for belief. Of all of the Gospels that say you have to make a decision. Are you going to be in opposition, or are you going to be on the side of Jesus? What do you believe? And it reminds me that while we're looking at all four Gospels together, each of the writers had a purpose. John's purpose so that people would believe. Matthew probably more to the fulfillment of all of those Old Testament prophecies. And Mark, in a much more succinct and rapid way, trying to get so much information in front of the Greco-Roman world that they're overwhelmed. And I feel that way sometimes when I read Mark's gospel. So many things catch my attention as we go through. What caught your attention? We have the microphones again available. Raise your hand. It won't take us too long to get to you. And then we'll work with that. Here we're going to start with Barrett.
What caught my attention was just what Larry was talking about in putting your hand to the plow and not looking back, or denying self to follow him. And if you didn't do that, then you're not worthy to follow Jesus. I just think it's very interesting in all these examples that were given in this video, just how, well, skeptics, would look at this and look at it one way, and others would look at it another way. And so the examples that are used here are just as repulsive or inviting 2,000 years ago as they are today. So it's not like the things that are mentioned in the Bible are outdated and just don't apply today, because people were reacting back then either one way or another the exact same way that people are reacting today.
Thank you, Barrett. And I have a follow-up question to Barrett's question, or Barrett's comment, and that is, remember we said that Jesus is purposefully soliciting responses. You can't not respond. You got to go one way or the other. I wonder sometimes when we tell the story, and even when we read the story, if we forget, you have to make a decision. You can't just do nothing. You've got to decide. To do nothing is to make a decision. But just as there were skeptics then who said, I'm looking at this evidence and I'm gone. And that's not the side I'm on. Others saw the same evidence and believed. And I think sometimes today, I guess this is no longer a question, but is Bob's comment, but you still have a question you may answer as I am answering it now. I wonder if sometimes we're too hesitant to solicit a response. Say, folks, you got to decide. You got to decide. I love you, and I want you to decide on the side I've decided on. But above all, you have to decide. You can't just be out there kind of half and half or nothing. On the fence. Exactly. So just those kinds of things just constantly attract my attention, especially when I read the Gospels together. Who else? Daryl up here. We have one, if you could please get the microphone up to Daryl, and that'll save me having to repeat either comment or question. Thank you.
You know, the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. And so it does not surprise me that they would conspire with the Pharisees to get rid of Lazarus, because Jesus just shot down their pinnacle belief.
Excellent. I'm sorry, I totally missed that. If anyone was going to be on the side of getting rid of the evidence with the resurrection Lazarus, it was going to be the folks who said, hey, there isn't any such thing as resurrection. Well, wait a minute. I think we have a problem here if you just look at the evidence around us. Thank you very much, Daryl. Who else has a comment or a question, a thought to follow up? We probably have room for a couple of more. Let's see. Okay, here we are.
And just to also contribute to Daryl's comment, the Pharisees were there. They believe in the resurrection. But like, was it Martha or Mary? Like she said, I know the resurrection is going to happen at the end. So the Pharisees believe in the resurrection, but it's not supposed to be like this. It's not supposed to be what Jesus is doing. It's supposed to be what we think is going to happen at the end of time. It's not supposed to happen like this. So they also have reason to conspire with the Sadducees against this resurrection in the now.
We believe in the resurrection, but not right now. Yeah, okay. Thank you, Zach, very much. Who else has a word or a comment? This is really your part of the class. I obviously can say a lot of things. Here we have Everett. For a couple of weeks, he was first, and today you may be last, Everett.
I've been holding back. What really baffles me, and it could go a lot of different directions, is whether you're Pharisee or Sadducee, you witnessed what you witnessed and still refused. Put yourself in that situation. If we seen what they seen, no matter what our beliefs previously, I think I'd change my mind. But they still refused to see. And you get into our lives now, we know what we know, and people still refuse to see or to believe or to accept.
And remember, we are where we are because of what we believe. And that's why we feel the challenges that Justin shared with us today. Because sometimes what we want and what we actually do give us an internal conflict. And yet, what has to supersede all of that is Jesus. It has to supersede it. Jesus is Lord. There's some powerful songs through the years that we've almost quit singing, and one of the ones that was so simple and we sang so much 30 years ago is Jesus is Lord. And that's not a bad thing to remind ourselves every morning also if you want something. If you want a shorter version of what Justin suggested as a morning prayer, you could just get up and say, Jesus is Lord. And just remind yourself of that. Well, thank you so much for participating and making this part of the class really work. We're going to, next week, bring Jesus to Jerusalem, not quite to the triumphal entry, but we'll look forward to it. God bless. Have a great afternoon. And also in your Connect groups, hook up and talk about Jesus.